When you think of old video games, you maybe are thinking of something from the 80s or the 90s. Depends on how old you personally are. But when I talk about old video games, I'm talking about a video game from the 1960s. Want to know more? Hi, I'm Stuart, and I am your middle-aged hack. Just a child of the 80s trying to make his way through the 20s, and I hope you'll take the journey with me. And today we're talking about the great-great-granddaddy of all video games. As far as anybody can tell, the very first video game that was ever invented. It was called Space War, or possibly Space War, 2 words, or possibly Space War with an exclamation point. It depends on who you ask. But one thing that we do know is that it was invented by a team that included a guy named Steve Russell back in 1962 at MIT. And this was a group of really young guys. You know, and yes, I do mean guys because it was the early 1960s, and let's be honest. So these folks were in their teens and early 20s, and they were working on the latest and greatest computer hardware at MIT, and naturally, they used it to play games. The 1960s was obviously a time of great change in the computer industry, and not the only decade with great change, but a lot of the things that we take for granted today, like the ability to type on a keyboard and see something on a screen, were invented in the 1960s. Before the 1960s, you either had to hand code things, or you could sometimes, if you had a modern device, you could type it, but it would come out one line at a time on a printer, and you couldn't go back up and change it because it wasn't like a screen where things could be changed. What happened was a bunch of people started adapting television technology to work with computers. But it wasn't just regular television technology. Regular televisions, and pretty much all tube televisions for consumer use up until tube televisions stopped being a thing, use an electron gun that uses magnets to make these lines one at a time, from top to bottom in a zigzag pattern. That's how they could get smooth motion. However, these terminals that were used for computers at that time used what were called vector graphics. Everything was kind of a graphic. What it was doing was, instead of going in this zigzag pattern, what it was doing was actually forcing the light to go to a specific point on the screen in a 2D grid. And that meant that you could have this really, really high level of detail, far more than you could with a raster grid. And that's why a lot of old games like the original Asteroids still look incredibly sharp, because you had this ability to really target points in space. This was first used to great effect by Digital Equipment Corporation with its PDP line of computers. And I talk a little bit more about Digital Equipment in this video. Digital Equipment's PDP-1 was really an amazing device, and it was one of the first that allowed you to just type on a keyboard and see it on a screen. Because everything was handled through this vector graphics system, it also meant that you could draw lines. You could have points in space. You could do pictures, as long as they were made of simple lines, because there was no shades of gray. It was either on or off, but it was a start. And naturally, the folks at MIT didn't want to just leave it at tabulating votes or finding out the answers to math equations. No, they wanted to play games. And that's where Space War came from. Space War was pretty simple. You had these 2 ships that faced each other, and each was controlled generally by a knob, and you could go forward, but there was gravity, so it would keep you going, and you shot at each other. If this sounds a little bit like Asteroids, you're absolutely right. Asteroids is 100% a descendant of Space War. Space War blew people's minds because nobody had ever played a video game before. It was the very first one, and everybody wanted it. Interestingly enough, there was no idea of software piracy in those days because there was no idea of copywriting software. So they just gave away the source code to Space War to anybody who wanted it. And it was adapted to pretty much any system that had a cathode ray terminal, because you couldn't do it on a printer. But pretty much any of these systems that, the guys wanted to run Space War on, they did. And that is how Space War actually gave birth to the entire video game industry. Because, you see, it was a guy named Nolan Bushnell, about 8-9 years later, who saw Space War, thought it was a great idea, and combined it with the coin box technology that was used in pinball machines, put it in this funky looking cabinet, called it Computer Space, and it was the first consumer video game. Consumer Space gave birth to Asteroids. Asteroids gave birth to Tempest and other color vector games. And really, the video game industry was off and running. The impact of Space War cannot be underestimated. It just started everything. And we owe a lot to that whole little team of people at MIT for just having the idea in the first place. Vector graphics kind of stopped being popular in the 1980s because video technology had gotten good enough that you could make recognizable characters like Mario and put them in cute settings. And yes, you could do color vector graphics, but you could only do 3 colors, red, blue, and green. That was it, because of the way that color monitors worked. So, vector graphics eventually, while it had its day, that day was over by the mid-1980s, and really computers themselves were not powerful enough to properly render vector graphics until only about 10 years ago was it possible to render what looked like convincing vector graphics using the graphics modes that were available on today's computers. You need a little bit better than HD resolution to do it, and that's the point. When you think about Space War and the entire video game industry that it spawned and all the people who made tons and tons and tons of money on video games, it's a shame, really, that none of that money really flowed back to Steve Russell and most of the people on his team whose names don't even appear anywhere on the internet. But they were incredibly influential. And maybe that's the lesson that we learn from Space War, is sometimes just being incredibly influential, sometimes just starting the ball rolling and watching it get bigger and bigger and bigger, it's its own reward. I think we'd all agree that money is also its own reward, and sometimes it's nice to have that too, but it's nice to think that that team of people, I'm pretty sure most of them are still around, they've got to be pretty elderly at this point. They've got to be proud of Space War and everything that it inspired. That's about it for me, the Middle-Aged Hack. Please do me a favor, like, subscribe, leave a comment, share. Do everything you can to help me build up this channel, because I don't want to be anonymous. I want to make some money and I want to get monetized. I can only do that with your help. I really appreciate you watching all the way through the video, and I will see you again next time.